All right, hello everybody, and welcome to Drawing Essentials Part 3. We're going to be working, of course, on cast drawing. It's really fascinating, I think, how deep we can dive into cast drawing. Over the last week, while I've been advertising this online, I've gotten a lot of questions about, well, how useful is cast drawing? What does cast drawing need to be in order for you to kind of grow as an artist while practicing it? And I think the best conclusion that I came to really is that cast drawing is just about as important as you allow it to be. For myself as a student, I dove really deeply into it. In fact, to the extent that in my third year, some of my painting instructors would make fun of me because I was still drawing casts, right? Like I should have been excited about color and painting still lifes with pears and apples and wine bottles and things, but I was really still drawn to classical sculpture, to figurative sculpture, and to the way that we can use it to interpret light and value and form and structure. The focus is going to be mostly the beginning stages, so I'm going to be focused on getting a great block in on the page. That means an envelope shape, that means a shadow shape, light shape dynamic that's organized. Hopefully we get a little bit of value, a little bit of halftone involved. This is the cast that we're going to be drawing today. As I said, it's the Girl of the Seine. It's a mask, so there is an amount of depth in it, but it's not necessarily like as round as like a full head. So there's not that kind of depth that we would expect from something that has a kind of 360-degree view. Now, the first thing that you notice in this, probably because it's red and it runs right through the middle of her face, is this perfect vertical line that I've drawn. Now, this is meant to represent what I use, of course, in like analog classes, right, in real life, called a plumb line. What a plumb line is essentially, right, is a weight at the end of a string that creates through gravity a kind of perfect vertical, right? And what we're looking for along this plumb line is to understand not necessarily exactly the center line of the face, even though it does kind of line up with the structural center of the face in this case. What we're looking for is basically features that line up together along that plumb line, right? So we understand that actually the peak of the forehead, for instance, happens to line up perfectly with the septum, where this is kind of contacting the front plane of the face. It also lines up pretty well perfectly with the low point, that kind of low V shape at the center of the upper lip, or that horizontal center line of the lips. And it also lines up roughly with this kind of center of the pit of the neck. Now, what's interesting about this is that you can see these are all really rather kind of disparate areas on the cast. There's a lot of distance in between them. And remember what I always say about kind of visual memory, which is really the exercise that we're trying to perform here. It is finite. So a distance like this, which is easy to memorize, is kind of quite different from a distance like this, which is quite difficult to memorize, right? So if I asked you to draw this one over here, I think most times, just by eyeballing it, you're going to get that correct within a millimeter or so of what it actually should be. Not the same with this one, right? I think you're going to have a lot more difficulty getting this one to be accurate if you're kind of reproducing it within a millimeter very far away. So let's take that back to the kind of drawing world, kind of take a look at what that means. Well, essentially what we're trying to say is that a distance like this allows us to kind of have gaps in our memory about the relationship vertically in between the septum and this area at the peak of the forehead. So what a plumb line is going to do when we draw it on the paper, or when we kind of judge via a plumb line these marks that we're going to make on the paper, is it kind of keeps them aligned. And so it's a kind of useful shorthand, or a way to kind of follow through something that maybe could be a weak point in your drawing otherwise. For those of you that have used a grid before, you'll understand that this is not totally dissimilar from some grid-like concepts. All of you, no doubt, have heard me speak at length over and over again, especially, by the way, in the Drawing Essentials series, about the nature of the shadow and the light shape. Right, so this is a kind of breakdown of the way that those two worlds coexist in this cast. I've made a little bit of a simplification here. You can see that all the lines are really rather straight and that all the edges are really rather hard. That's not something that's going to exist in our drawing actually, but it's something that's useful so that we understand kind of the proportion of shadow and light that we're dealing with and how we're going to group it, right? Notice that the shadow on the cast and the shadow on the background, I'm treating those as being very similar, like for the purposes of this diagram. To me, this represents the way that there are two worlds, essentially. There's a world of shadow and a world of light. And this is like the primary basis that I use to get a drawing to become visual. You can keep your drawing really simplified and really abstract, so long as there is some overriding concept that maybe ties it together with the visual world. This is one that is really foundational in the sense that all of the model packs that I use, all of the education that I've taken, all of it in a way relates to this idea. Even all of the kind of abstract structural stuff that I do, it actually still relates to this idea that I'm searching for a way to interpret shadow and light. The envelope shape is something I discussed a little bit in bark drawings. It is the concept of a linear contour that follows around the edges of a subject. It's a simple idea, and it's a powerful idea also because of that. So I'm going to point out the things that I find really useful about it and the things that I think are maybe a little bit kind of stand in your way slightly, right? So the envelope shape is very much like an outside-in philosophy, and it fits together really well with the beginning of how we draw, right? So I'm choosing the top and bottom of the cast. I'm going to go ahead and indicate some of the largest lines that I can find that basically create a kind of, if you're familiar with like the idea of like sculpting from marble, right, where you have to start with the kind of broadest lines and kind of hatch away or carve away to find the smaller, more like kind of subtle shapes. What we're doing is kind of creating that block of marble that eventually we're going to carve away from. This is what the kind of initial lines look like. You can see that I've even left these really large kind of negative areas out here. So it's a super simplified concept that we're actually going to get some utility out of. And maybe this is a mistake that's often made when thinking about, talking about, and using the envelope shape. If you feel that you're in that club of misusing it, don't feel bad. It's really just about how well you get to know it that determines how well you can use it, right? So it is, in a sense, a little bit arbitrary. It's not really relating to anything inside the figure. There's nothing, not even really the vertical center line of the face is being represented. Literally, these are like the first 10 lines that we have on the paper, and they're all about what is outside the subject. But what can we do with that, right? Well, the first thing that we can do is start out a view of what the kind of vertical and horizontal relationships are in between certain points. If I create a vertical axis that hits the edge of this high point on the right-hand side, I can understand in a way what the distance in between secondary high points and that primary high point is, right? So judging sort of widths like that, I think are really one really useful thing that we can do with this envelope shape. We can also look for, this one of course relates to being outside the subject, so we can also take a passage like this, which is not the highest high point on this section of the cast. But what I'm going to look for is basically what other points it relates to inside. So let's look at this kind of secondary high point that I've chosen here, and I can search for in a way like the distance or relationship in between those that I've found because of that. You can also see how it tends to line up as well with this section, which is going to relate to kind of the next phase of the envelope shape, which is you start breaking down a little bit further, creating a little bit more complexity within the subject, and that means getting into those negative shapes that I left out before. Kaiser Knight Eyes is asking, would you suggest we push the measurement process as far as we can before moving on? I think that for students, there's a really cool but also maybe treacherous moment that you have when you start to learn about measuring. The thing that happens in general is you get this connect the dots approach starting to happen. It's perfectly natural, but it's not really drawing. So what I'm talking about is we start to learn that we can measure, and so maybe we overuse measuring. It's why I mentioned at first the kind of 80-20 principle that I have about measuring versus drawing, that I try to make 2 or 3 measurements and then draw for a while. take 2 or 3 measurements, and then draw for a while. I think this keeps you an active player in the drawing rather than a passive observer or measurer. The thing for a student is that part of what you're learning also is how to make measurements. So probably you're going to measure a little bit more than I would, already knowing how to make measurements. So don't be afraid of it, but also understand that it is an iterative thing that over time you'll get very, very used to. So you don't necessarily need to overdo it when you start out. So making all the possible measurements that you can before you actually start drawing can be, I don't know, interesting, but also hopefully it doesn't become a pattern that you become like a super measurer, and that kind of takes over a little bit of your process. So totally fine in the beginning, but we want to whittle it down to a slightly smaller amount and keep ourselves a little bit more actively involved in creating visual impressions of our subjects, which in the end, eventually, we can make much more acute measurements of with our eye, right? The comparison that I like to make really often is between how we take a physical measurement or a visual measurement and how we actually evaluate things through recognition, right? So to measure, I usually use like the edge of my pencil, right? So I take like the tip of the pencil and the spot where the pencil kind of aligns with my finger here. I take a measurement and I kind of compare that. So that is literally the tool that I use to take a measurement. Now, when I have a shadow shape and a light shape and some halftones and construction going on in a very recognizable subject, what I'm using to make measurements and evaluations is my eye and my mind, which are infinitely more sophisticated than a pencil and the edge of my finger. Sampo Peltola is asking, is there a danger of getting too attached to measuring and plumb lines? A cast is like a laboratory environment that doesn't necessarily adapt well to the chaos of life drawing. I think that laboratory aspect of it you can view as kind of a control situation or a control zone. And that makes it actually very easy for you to focus on learning how to use a plumb line, because the model is not going to move. The model, he or she, is not going to take a break. There's going to be very little interaction in between like you and the kind of view of the model that can change as well. So I think that laboratory aspect is in fact a kind of an asset. Can it create a situation where you lean a little bit too much on measuring? Yes, it can, but I think over the long term, right? If we're talking, I took 4 years to be a student of drawing and painting. Over that time, inevitably, you kind of find your correct position, your sweet spot in terms of how much you're going to use measuring and how much you're going to use intuitive, observational skills to kind of help you get to a place that's accurate. In addition to that, really, not everybody's going to be working within the same genres. For instance, like a still life painter, a lot of people go on and their profession in a way is still life painting. And so the measurement aspect is actually something that they get to use really throughout everything that they do. There are those of you that are going to go out there and be alla prima figure painters, and that's really your passion. Again, the measurement there will do a little bit less for you because the model's always breaking, things are changing, whatever. Other things are happening. So I think that it's kind of different strokes for different folks. If you're going to be in a field where measuring is something that is highly useful, maybe it's a good thing that you actually really get used to it. But I think over time, water finds its level. You'll find your correct position to be in. Without further ado, let's dive in, and I'll start talking to you about one of the things that I think is so important in doing cast studies that actually is going to echo out into everything that you do from this point forward, and that is doing thumbnail studies, right? So a thumbnail is essentially the simplest version that you can draw of something to help you understand the basis for what it will look like. This is going to take place when you're doing your cast drawings. This is going to take place if you're doing a giant multi-figure composition, right? So if you're looking at the Raft of the Medusa, a famous giant painting in the Louvre, you're going to be able to make a thumbnail of that that's going to help you understand the value organization of it. So it's a vehicle for you to understand your subjects, but also, by the way, in that instance where I'm describing making a kind of master study out of it, it's also something that echoes out into how you can look at other artworks to understand what those artists were doing, how they were seeing things, because it's a practice also, by the way, that is not new. It's about as old probably as making 2D pictures is. The next thing that I'm going to do is actually use my plumb line. So I've got here what is a 5 crown Norwegian coin, which happens to have like a little hole in the middle of it. And I've tied a string to that, just ordinary twine, just something small and simple. And because my paper is tilting back a little bit, I'm going to lean it on the paper. But basically what we're getting here is that sense of like a perfect vertical, right? So you can make a plumb line for yourself at home, and you can kind of decide where effectively the center of your drawing is going to be. And for me, I'm going to put mine a little bit off center. I'm going to put that in the center in a way of the distance in between like the edge of my study here and the edge of the kind of visible paper here. This brings up in this moment like a concept that I think is really useful to have when you're making these drawings, and that is the expected levels of inaccuracy at a given stage of the drawing. So at the moment, I'm looking to get these measurements accurate within, I don't know, probably a centimeter of where they actually are. So if I'm within a centimeter of being accurate, I'll be quite happy with that. I'll view that as a kind of success. If I'm a little bit more than a centimeter, then maybe I'm doing something something that needs adjusting. But I bring that up because I want you to kind of understand that these lines are not, accuracy really has not even entered the drawing as a paradigm we can use to evaluate anything yet. I mean, this is just a schematic version of what we're seeing. And you should kind of keep that in mind. Okay, so that is the first pass on the envelope shape. I think it took us, because I was talking, it took us about 25 minutes. So maybe like right on the button as far as how long it should technically take you to get something on the paper. What we can do at this moment is really actually start to look at our subject and ask the question like how much does this look or not look like it, right? I mean, if we consider like the character of the cast, does she feel like she's a little bit too pointy at the top? Yeah, for sure. Like these two angles here are way oversimplified. And if you remember from Drawing Essentials Part 1 and 2, when I said you have 2 jobs when you're blocking in, right? You need to simplify and express the subject. Now here, definitely we've simplified, right? Have I expressed the subject in that area? Not so much. So things are going to happen like a little bit more rapidly now that we've got this kind of overall sense kind of ironed out. I'm going to go straight away into some of the shadow shapes and some of the shadow edges that I think are going to make an impact at this early stage. So I'm going to start with one that's really quite central, quite close to the plumb line. So that would be the form shadow at the edge of the nose on the left-hand side. Now I'm even going to go as far as to indicate a little bit some of the angle breaks that are happening in that. Now once you have like a kind of confident linear structure, you can, I think, quite rapidly get into the idea of like kind of shadow and light shapes. It's one of the reasons that I believe so much in linear structure is how efficient it makes the other aspects of what you're drawing, right? If you're really only relying on shapes and kind of shape-based, value-based information, I think that eventually it can become, in a way, like pretty inefficient. I think there's this moment that students will go through when they are learning to draw in this way, where they realize, well, what if I just dove into the value shapes straight away? What if I didn't even bother with the linear section? In an effort to become efficient, in fact, they cast away one of the things that is actually making them most efficient, which is having like a really well organized linear structure to kind of set them on their way in terms of a beginning of accuracy, right? Now, another thing that I've been kind of going back and forth about really is the nature of this cast shadow. Am I going to include the cast shadow in the drawing? The argument for it would be that we'd get to see really well, like the sense of kind of unity in between these two shadow zones. The argument against it would be that it's really long, laborious, and maybe does not make for very compelling tutorial content. So let's just say that for now, if I do end up including that cast shadow, it's probably something that I'm going to speed up so that I can get it all tucked in and get it related very well to the kind of shadow values inside the figure, but that we don't spend too much time really just kind of watching me go over a flat value. Either way, one of the things that you should understand about it is the nature of the shadow edge in different areas. So the closer that shadow edge is to the form that's casting that shadow, the sharper that edge is going to be. As you can see out here, we get to a really, really soft, really broad modulated edge. And here, we're just a little bit harder. Now, here's the thing. This is a hard version of a cast shadow edge. But for sure, it's not really a hard edge in its own right. If we take a look at the form shadow edge here at the bridge of the nose, this is what a hard shadow edge looks like. This is still relatively soft, and this out here is incredibly soft. I mean, look at this one. It's almost a pure transition by the time we come out here. So one of the things that drawing that cast shadow would allow you to exercise is that distinct range in terms of like how soft a soft edge can become in graphite. I've said over and over again that I really feel like it's a matter of mentality and understanding what the character of the edge is rather than a technique problem. It's not actually that it's difficult to get a pencil point to make a soft edge. It's more that if you set out to make a soft edge, it's a whole lot easier. But that is something that you have to practice, something that you have to get used to, and this would be an instance to do that. Now, that can also be practiced here inside the figure when we look at the spectrum of soft and hard edges available to us within the cast. So by no means should you feel that missing out on the cast shadow that is cast onto the wall behind the cast, that you would somehow only have that opportunity to study soft versus hard edges. We definitely have that within the cast as well. The final thing that I want to mention in this self-assessment at the end of this particular section is the treatment of various edges throughout the drawing. They're essentially pretty simplified. I've tried to keep it to two basic kinds of edges, an edge just about like this and an edge just about like this. This one here being kind of the softer of the two. And all of those edges are made of me kind of building up slowly the concentration of value along that boundary between light and shadow. Really, everything in your drawing at this moment should be a light and slow buildup of value that will lead you to have exactly the kind of edge or exactly the kind of value shape that you're looking for. No edges, not even sharp ones like these, should be made up of a fast and deep and hard mark with your pencil, because at this moment we're still in this kind of like 50-50 stage of is it accurate, is it not accurate? I'm not totally sure. There's a lot of questions to still ask. There's a lot of improvements to the visual impression to make before we get it to look enough like this that we can answer with some kind of certainty that question of is it right, is it not right?